Okay, guys, this episode is one for the books for me. I feel so incredibly lucky to have started this podcast with just the desire to chat with my friends about books and about writing and how difficult it can be sometimes. And, you know, I've had the ability to interview some of my favorite authors and to become friends with authors who I've interviewed too. And the author I have on the podcast today is Claire Legrand, who is an author who I have followed for quite some time, and she's pretty much the author I want to be when I grow up. She is amazing, and you guys are really going to love getting to know her and hearing her journey through publishing. She has her 9th book that just came out, Lightbringer, which is the finale of the Imperium Trilogy. And if you've been following me, you know how much I love this series. I've posted about Furyborn and about Kingsbane, and they've been the favorite book on the podcast and all over my Instagram. And this book is no different. It's going to be just as amazing, and you guys are really going to love getting to know Claire. Okay, Claire, can you please tell me about your upcoming novel and conclusion to the Furyborn series, Lightbringer?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Lightbringer is a book 16 years in the making. I've been working on the Imperium Trilogy since I was 18. And it is really, really satisfying to see this series come to a conclusion. The ending is exactly what I wanted it to be years and years ago when I first came up with the idea. Obviously, I won't get into the ending right now, yes. But it is exactly what I have always imagined. Both the beginning of the trilogy with the prologue of Furyborn and the end of the trilogy with the conclusion of Lightbringer have basically stayed the same the entire time I've been working on the trilogy. So it's been really nice to have that end point in mind to focus on as I go through the entire trilogy.
Yeah.
And what can I say that's not spoilerific? Well, I won't say anything about the end of Kingsbane, but the end of Kingsbane is a lot.
Yes,
and,
it is.
At the beginning of Lightbringer, both Riel and Eliana, the two protagonists of the Imperium Trilogy, are they're not doing great. There's been a lot of turmoil and a lot of upheaval in their lives, and they're trying to grapple with that as best they can in their respective situations. This ultimately for me has been a story about the relationship between women and their power, how to come to terms with the power that they have and how to use that power even when everyone around them, even though people who are well-intentioned and love them, are trying to guide them down a particular path. But what path do they want to walk? What do they want to do with their power? At the beginning of the trilogy, the two women are trying to decide if they are, in fact, the subjects of a prophecy that says 2 queens will rise, one of blood and one of light, one with the power to save the world, one with the power to destroy it. And so there's this whole good queen, bad queen dichotomy that is a big part of basically the world religion that they are a part of, even separated by centuries as they are. And so the questions that I wanted to grapple with throughout the trilogy are, okay, what does good queen and bad queen mean? Like, what is good and bad, and who gets to decide that? And these girls, are they doomed to have to live within this very strict binary of good and bad? Or is it what, of course, it actually is, which is that every human is both good and bad, and we all have light and dark inside of us, and that's something that they are coming to terms with over the course of the trilogy. And it's been so wonderful to grow with these characters. I've spent all of my professional creative life with them. They feel like a part of me and also like dear friends. And which is funny, I guess, because I put them through a lot. You don't want to put your friends through a lot, no. but I do with them. But they're so strong, and I don't mean strong in the sense of like, oh well, she's a woman and she wields a sword and she wears armor just like a dude would, and so she's strong. I mean, they are strong in that they are very complex and very, very messy and flawed and full of love and full of courage, and then in the next moment they can be very cowardly, and they can be selfish and then selfless the next moment. They are full of complexities.
Yeah.
And I love that about them. I love that complex strength that they each have. Their capacity to love is endless, and their capacity to destroy is also pretty substantial, which is true for all of us. So I really loved exploring those two women. And in Lightbringer, I mean, the magic is weirder, the stakes are higher, everything is in immediate acute peril. It's the finale of a trilogy, so lots of stuff happens, lots of things need to be resolved. There are some twists and turns and reveals that I hope are satisfying for readers. It's been really fun to see everyone's theories over the years. I love the last few chapters of Lightbringer, especially. Just, they mean so much to me. I think out of everything I've written, I'm proudest of those last few chapters. So I really hope that readers enjoy this book. That was a really long answer to your question.
No, it's
that's
fine.
Lightbringer. See, when I can't give actual concrete information, I just ramble for long minutes at a time.
You're fine. I love it. I remember being just blown away by Furyborn, and then Kingsbane. I'm still trying to process the ending and get through it.
That's fair.
Yes, I mean, you put the characters through a lot, and you put the reader through a lot emotionally. But I'm so excited to read the conclusion, and I know that when you are on social media, I remember you mentioning that it had been a book, the series had been with you, and you'd been working on it for a very long time. So that's awesome. Well,
thank you.
I know that these aren't your only books that you've had published. You've had quite a few other books published. So tell me a little bit about your journey to getting where you are and having, that first book published.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's journey, I love this question. And whenever I watch other authors' events, I love hearing their answers because everyone's journey is so different.
Yes.
And it's just fascinating to see how everybody gets from then to now.
Yeah.
For me, I was... I came up with the idea for the Imperium Trilogy when I graduated high school, the summer right after high school. And I had always loved books and storytelling, but I had never done it seriously. I never really wrote much for fun, except for little stories when I was a kid. But I had this idea just sort of come to me on a family trip. And the idea was Riel. I saw her, and it was from a moment toward the end of Lightbringer is basically what I saw. And I was fascinated by this and kept asking myself questions about her. Who is this woman? And why is she surrounded by a field of fire? And why is she so angry and so sad? And what kind of power is this? And who loves her and who hates her? And so I started asking myself questions, and the story grew around her. And then a couple of years later, I left music behind. That's what I was studying in college. I used to be a trumpet player, and it was my goal to play in the New York Philharmonic someday. Quite a lofty goal. It would never have happened. It wasn't good enough. But music has really informed who I am as an artist, as a creator, and so I don't regret it at all. But it was a big life switch. I left music behind, decided I wanted to focus on writing. Had no idea what I was going to do for a day job. I started working at the university library just as a student assistant, and that became my day job. I got my library degree, and all the while I was working on this idea, and I kept developing it and writing many drafts, most of which were terrible, many different versions of the same story.
Yes.
The draft of Furyborn, which was not called Furyborn back in the day, that I ended up trying to query. Well, not trying to query. I did query. I was trying to get an agent. That did not happen.
Yeah.
The draft that I ended up sending out to agents was 347,000 words long.
Oh my goodness.
Just no book should be that long.
No.
And especially not a young adult fantasy book.
No.
But I first of all, I didn't do a lot of research before querying. I just I was like, yeah, this book, I love it. I'm going to get an agent. And I just threw things out into the universe. And people were like, no, what are you doing? No, this is way too long. It's not good. But I loved this story so much. I believed in it. It sounds so cheesy, but Riel came to me that day, and I built up this story around her. And ever since then, I have been so in love with it. I've believed in it over the years, even when no one else did. And it's kept me going, both on a professional and a personal level, even when times were really tough. So that kind of oblivious confidence allowed me to send out this 350,000 word manuscript. I did not get any offers of representation, as one might imagine. But then later, I did meet who ended up being my first agent. I met her at a writers' conference in Dallas, and she had requested the manuscript based on my query. And we sat down, and she was very generous with her time. I didn't realize at the time how extraordinary this was, but we basically sat down for like 2-3 hours, and she talked to me about like all the stuff I needed to fix and all of the things I wasn't really, really very good at.
Right.
And then she said, hey, there's something here, but I don't really know what it is. And there's something with your writing that I like, but like, wow, you need to work a lot harder at this, and you're just not there yet. And then she said, please, keep me updated. When you write something else, let me know. And I was heartbroken. Yes. Write something else. What? There is no else. It's just Riel and Eliana. What are you talking about? I still have the notebook that I had scribbled down notes in while she was talking, and just my handwriting is so shaky because I was so nervous.
I bet.
And then I tried for like a couple of years querying before I just became so frustrated. I still have a lot of my rejection letters printed out. I should have brought that over here, but it's like this long scroll of like 70 something rejection letters from agents that I printed out and I keep taped together. And then my last semester of grad school, I decided, okay, forget it. I am just going to write something else, and I'm going to have fun, and it's going to be easy and simple. And I wrote what ended up becoming my first book, my first published book, The Cavendish Home for Boys and Girls, which was I think my first draft was like 30,000 words. It was really slim. It was like this creepy little fairy tale that did not have a huge expansive world with lots of characters. Right. It was just a very simple story. And then I reached out to that agent and I said, hey, I wrote something else, and let me know what you think. And she said, oh, I like this. This I can sell. And so I signed with her, and I told her when I first signed with her, I said, I really, really want to go back to Furyborn someday. Again, it wasn't called that at the time.
Right.
And she said, okay, but first we're doing this. And so, that was the beginning of my publishing career, which is just evidence that sometimes you have to put things aside when you get stuck and they're not working, and do something else for a while. And it opens up opportunities and opens up ways of thinking that you may not have expected. And then over the years, I kept writing other things, and always kept coming back to Furyborn between projects. And okay, throw that out, start over for take number 53, and the core of the story remained the same, but the iterations varied pretty drastically over the years as I was trying to figure out, how do I weave this into a story that people actually want to read, that will actually sell, that's not 350,000 words of drivel, So it took a while, but every book that I wrote in the meantime, I think really taught me a lot about myself as a writer and as a person. And so by the time this was, Furyborn was ready to sell, to go out on submission with, I felt ready. I felt, okay, I finally learned enough to be able to do this properly.
Yeah. That's awesome. I do love this question too, because hearing each author's journey is so different. There's so many different little hiccups and hills and valleys that they go through. But I love your point. The more you write, the more you know about yourself as a person, as a writer, and just the better you get at it, right? So Furyborn was like kind of what catapulted you. Riel was what catapulted you into it, but she wasn't quite ready for you yet. So you had to take a little longer.
Ready. I wasn't ready for her.
You weren't ready for her. That's right.
I feel like, I don't know, I feel like every year that has passed since I came up with the idea, not only has it made me, which you mentioned, like you learn through doing, right? So every project that you work on teaches you about yourself as a writer, but also just like the life experience that I have gained since I was 18, for goodness sake. That has really informed my storytelling too. So it's fascinating to go back and look at some of those really early drafts. Like, wow, you were definitely 18 when you started this.
Yeah.
It's so ambitious and so earnest, but just, it's like I threw everything I loved about fantasy into one book without any sense of like restraint.
Yes. You're like, I am going to make this the most fantasy book out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, tell me, so did you ever, query anybody else besides that agent? It sounds like you've moved on from that agent. Maybe just with your experience where you are now, do you have any tips for writers who are in the querying process?
Yeah, the querying process is tough. I mean, it just is.
Yeah.
It was really hard on me. I did not handle it very well. A lot of the time, I grew very impatient with the process because I believed in my story so much.
Yeah.
And every rejection just was like a brick upon my soul, right? I just felt like, wow, I am worthless.
Yeah.
And nobody likes this story. Am I crazy for loving this story so much? I don't get it. Why does no one else get it? And I also, I've lived with anxiety and depression disorders since I was young. And so, wow, was the querying process a trigger for all kinds of mental health difficulties. And I think if I could go back to my younger self who was querying, I would tell her something that I actually heard from another author, Roshni Chokshi, who has written many, many wonderful books. She and I did an event one time, and she said that her dad once told her, Roshni, you are not a jug of milk. You don't have an expiration date.
Oh, I love that.
And I love that. It's so great. I just when she said that, those words, I grabbed onto them and I hold them so close to my heart because I wish I could go back and tell my younger self, okay, Claire, 18, 19, 20-year-old Claire, you need to calm down. You do not have an expiration date.
Yeah.
Your story is not going to be done by someone else because nobody can tell this story the way you can.
Yeah.
But I was desperate at that age. I was like, oh my gosh, if I don't get this published right now, somebody else is going to do it and they're going to do it better. And then, my characters will be dead forever and no one will care. And I wish I could go back and tell her, it's going to happen and it's not going to happen how you thought it would. And it's going to be messy and really frustrating at times, but just hold on to how much you love your story and be open to other experiences in the meantime. It's just so hard to have patience, especially when you're a young querying writer. But I imagine for any querying writer at any age, it's so hard to have patience.
It's so hard. I am possibly the most impatient person you will ever meet. And I don't understand why I choose to do this. The publishing process in itself is just so slow. And I don't do slow. I want it now, right?
Yeah, it begs the question, why do we do this to ourselves, really? But it's for the love of story, right? And sharing story with others. That's what you have to hold on to in the midst of everything else. I tell students when I do school visits, you have to, whatever you're working on, it needs to bring you joy. You have to believe in it. It has to mean a lot to you. You have to have fun with it because otherwise it's just not worth all the pain and all the frustration.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think that is such a smart thing to remember. And why a lot of us sit down and try and write something is because we love what we're about to write about, or there's a character that we are close to, or a situation that, sometimes for me it's just been so therapeutic to just fictionalize maybe something that's really going on in my life and figure it out through that whole process, right? But when you add in, when you make it, not joyful, or you're trying to write a book that you don't have a passion for just because you think it'll sell, that makes it a lot more difficult to go through the whole process.
Yeah, I've tried that. It doesn't work for me.
No, it doesn't work.
You're absolutely right. It's it's such a challenging process, and the joy and the passion for your work makes it bearable.
Yeah.
So I really think that's the thing to focus on more than anything as a creator of any kind, is really love what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because that comes through in the work.
Yes. And we all need more joy right now. So just focus on the joy.
Yes. In the creative process, I think that's so important. Seek out the joy and the joy of the process and the joy of the characters and the world, whatever it is you're working on, and hold on fiercely to that.
Yes, for sure. My next question for you is a two-parter. I'd love to know what the hardest part of writing is for you, and then the hardest part of being an author.
Well, hardest part of being an author for me, as somebody who, as I mentioned, has depression and anxiety disorders, it's really hard sometimes to be in the public eye, even on a very small scale, because I really want everybody to love my work, and I really want everyone to understand like the kind of stories I'm trying to tell. And that's just unrealistic, because not everybody's going to love your work, and not everybody's going to get it. And I, of course, as a creator, still have a long way to go, and because that's a lifelong process, like perfecting your craft. And so, I have a hard time sometimes shutting out the voices of readers, reviewers, just the general world outside my little bubble. Sometimes I have a hard time shutting those out, just temporarily at least, so I can focus on the work itself. I doubt myself a lot. I have a lot of insecurities, and I think it's funny being a creator, being a writer specifically, because that's what I can speak to. It's this weird kind of dichotomous existence of like, well, you have to have an ego because you have to think that people care about what you have to say.
Right.
But then also, wow, you're so like, I mean, every writer I know has like deep insecurities about their voice, their vision, their capabilities. So it's a very strange, contradictory existence.
It is.
But yeah, having to grapple with that kind of doubt while people are consuming your work and paying attention to you, that has been really tough. The hardest part of being a writer, I guess, is kind of similar. It's being able to hold on, like figuring out how to hold on to the love of a project in the midst of all the challenges of figuring out the technical aspects of the writing craft.
Right.
Like not letting that stamp out the love and the joy of what you're working on. That is really tough. And just on a granular level, pacing is really hard for me. Like on a craft level, that is something that I'm constantly having to work on. And also action scenes.
Oh yeah.
I hate writing action scenes, and yet I had to write them for the Imperium Trilogy. Like, wow, for someone who hates action scenes, maybe you shouldn't have written like an epic fantasy. I don't know. But I did. And so I had all these action scenes, and I just hate them. And I get compliments on them all the time. Like, wow, that was really great. The way you wrote that action scene, I'm like, oh, thanks. I hate it. Like, I hate it so much. I hate writing them. Why can't everyone just like sit around in pretty dresses and talk about their feelings?
Exactly.
Why do we have to have action and plot? I don't know. But yeah, so that's another very long answer to your question. But both of those things are kind of related at this point in my career. The things that are tough for me as an author and tough for me as a writer have become sort of inextricably linked in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, let's flip the question. Let's talk about the best parts. What's the best part of being a writer and an author for you?
Well, I love connecting with what I call my ideal reader. So every now and then I connect with someone who, like, do we share a brain? I don't know, but they like absolutely get every single nuance of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
One of my favorite independent bookstores, shout out to Second Star to the Right bookstore in Denver, Colorado, and a couple of the booksellers there, we've just connected because they totally understand everything that I'm trying to do, and they connect with my stories on a level that is really intense and deep and complex. And that is so rewarding as a writer to know that, okay, maybe not everybody, resonates. Maybe my story doesn't resonate with everybody on this level, but if I can just find a few people who really just respond to my story in this way that seems so profound and life-changing, like that is incredibly rewarding. Because for me, I don't want to write just for myself. I want to write to share with people. And so that has been, those moments that have occurred throughout my career have been extremely rewarding. Just to know that, like, 'cause sometimes, and I'm sure you feel the same way, sometimes when you're just at home creating by yourself, you feel like, who cares?
Yes.
Like, why am I doing this? I'm alone and I'm doing this thing and just nobody, what do I know? What do I, why do I think I have anything worth saying? But then those moments of connection, I think, are so powerful. And I think they're kind of what draws us to storytelling in the first place, that connection that you can have with the story as a reader. That connection is so powerful. There's something magical in that connection, and seeking out that connection through my work, like trying to make that happen with as many people as I can, just it makes everything feel worth it, really. Yeah. So that's really fun. Sounds kind of like a pale way of saying that sounds really fun. It's more than fun. But yes. On a granular level, like craft stuff, the most fun, the best parts of writing are for me playing with language. I just love trying out different combinations of words and different rhythms for my sentences, and I love developing voice, and I just think it's so fun I love getting to line edits, which is when, like, the content is mostly there. Now we're just getting into the nitty gritty. Right. And I love playing with sentences and trying to, I read them aloud a lot. And as a musician, I'm really, like, concerned with the rhythm of sentences. And, so I love playing around with that kind of stuff. That gives me life.
That's awesome. Well, I think both things that both of your answers to that I love. I totally agree with you. Writing is such a solitary act, right? Like, I mean, we'd have to do it by ourselves. You could sit at a coffee shop with a bunch of other writers, but you're still writing your own story. But I think the goal is always connection and finding those readers who really have that, like, great connection with your book. I mean, that would make it all worth it. I can understand.
Yeah, I mean,
that.
It makes, not to sound too grandiose and philosophical, but those connections with people, whether it's through storytelling or through, I don't know, if you're on a sports team with people, or you just meet somebody at the grocery store, back when you could talk to people at grocery stores. But those connections, in whatever medium they occur, like, they are what make life worth living to me. Like, they remind you of how interconnected everything is and how we are all part of this same weird world. And it just makes you feel closer and less lonely, closer to people and less lonely. So yeah, there's something very powerful. And that's why I keep doing this with all the other stuff that's really hard and anxiety inducing. Like, that's why I keep coming back to it, I think, to try to capture those moments as many times as I can.
That's awesome. I miss talking to people in the grocery store. I was such a chatter with random people, and now it's like we're all just trying to get in and out as fast as possible. But I remember the last time I talked to someone in a grocery store was like, I don't know, April, maybe May, and it was this nice old man, and he gave me a book of recipes after we were done shopping. Like, it was the best. I miss that so much.
Oh gosh, I miss it too. And it's almost like books and storytelling, those have become even more precious right now because our methods of communicating with each other are limited. Yeah. So connecting through story, I think, is maybe more powerful now than it's ever been. Yes. So we got to hold on to that where we can.
We do indeed. Well, I'd love to know a little bit about your writing style. So do you consider yourself more of a pantser, more of a planner, or somewhere in between?
So I'm a planner or a plotter or whatever you want to call it. I for each book, I have spreadsheets that I use to plot out each storyline and each, like, character arc. And I spend a lot of time, I guess you could call it, an idea always spends a lot of time cooking with me before I actually start writing. So things are kind of simmering on various burners for a long time before I actually start drafting. So I spend a lot of time brainstorming and planning, not only with my spreadsheets, but with playlists and like Pinterest boards and whatever I can do to sort of, through various media, organize my thoughts. And
Yeah.
that takes a long time. Like some people can come up with an idea and they shoot it off in like a month. And I don't know how people do that. It takes me years to really, for an idea to really develop and for me to really feel comfortable enough with it to start writing.
Yeah.
But even with all that planning, I've heard people who are more on the pantser side of things, like, oh, well, that's boring. It's all outlined ahead of time, so you don't have those moments of discovery. Well, I'm here to tell you that for me anyway, it doesn't matter how beautiful and organized my spreadsheet is, inevitably I get into the drafting and it changes anyway.
Yeah.
So it's just, writing is messy no matter how you try to tackle it. But for me, I have to have all that stuff in place before I start writing. Otherwise, the blank page is just too scary. I have to have my little spreadsheet to get me started.
Oh, yeah.
What about you? Are you a pantser or a plotter?
I lean more towards the pantsing side. And I do share that sentiment of like planning it out too much, like does take the magic out of it for me a little bit. But I do like a really rough first draft and then do a lot of planning afterwards to get through the revision process. But I definitely still go into it with like a basic idea of what it's going to be and, getting to know the characters a little bit. But I have a lot of like 10 or 20 like first 5 pages of things that I've like, got written down and then I'll go back to later. But yeah, I definitely am more on the pantser side of it.
I love, that's another question that I love, because I love hearing how everybody approaches this whole daunting thing of trying to write a book out of nothing, create something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, which is, again, something I tell students. There's no wrong way to write a book. You plan, you pants, whatever you need to do is right.
Yeah.
Whatever works for you and your creative process.
Exactly. And I think sometimes it can take a little bit to find out your creative process. I know the first book I wrote, I outlined it super hardcore and went through the process that way. And it was hard. And I did feel, I felt like I did the outline and spent so much time on it that I had to stick to it, right? Like I didn't give myself wiggle room. Like I was like, no, I have to do what I planned. And now I know like, okay, I can change things up if I do an outline beforehand. But, I love that question too, because we all do things a little bit differently. And to those people who are still figuring out their process, it can maybe give them a little spark of inspiration to try something new.
I hope so. And if this is encouraging at all, or maybe it's discouraging, I don't know. But I feel like, Lightbringer will be my 9th published book. And I feel like my process is even messier now than it was at the beginning. And I'm constantly trying to still figure it out. Like, I feel like it's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And I, again, could be comforting. Like, it's always messy. It's not just me, and could also be very discouraging, but I like to fall on the comforting side of that spectrum. Like, I think that's as it should be. Like, we should always be trying to push ourselves and change and grow and learn. And with all of that comes a lot of mess.
It does indeed. And I think too, depending on the book you're writing, it might call for a different process, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I can imagine an epic fantasy requires a lot of planning and world building, keeping things straight, but maybe, like your first book that was published didn't require maybe as much because it was a more simpler story.
Yes, absolutely. You might have heard me sigh when you said, when you write an epic fantasy, because I was thinking like, oh God, why? Every now and then, as much as I loved that story, I'd be like, oh my gosh, why did I decide to do this? Because it was such a complex story, and it did require a lot of planning. Yeah. It's just, again, why do we do this to ourselves? For the love of story. That's what we'll keep saying.
For the love of story. Well, my next question is, when did your love of, writing begin? And you kind of shared, that Riel came to you, right? But had you toyed with it before, or, had maybe other ideas beforehand and just hadn't tackled them as head on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when I was young, I wrote a little bit, like I think you mentioned. I just wrote like little stories here and there about horses mostly. But I didn't write a lot of those stories down. A lot of the storytelling I did when I was younger was in my head. I would listen to music from an early age and come up with stories to music. And that was like my main mode of storytelling, private secret internal storytelling for most of my childhood and adolescence. Riel, the arrival of Riel on the scene, I guess you could say, when I was 18 was like the first time I had a story idea where I felt like I have to write this.
Yeah.
I have to take this seriously, and I have to pursue publication. I don't know. I mean, I was going to say, I don't know what it was about her that elicited that response, but I know what it was. I mean, it's Riel. She
It's Riel.
She was like, okay, hey, you're going to write this, and it's about me, and you're going to write it now.
Yes.
But yeah, before that, I didn't really have anything else that I wanted to pursue seriously.
Yeah.
That was the first thing.
That's a pretty, and I feel like incredible way too to have it kind of all push you towards, I mean, Riel coming to you when I can't wait to read Lightbringer and to kind of see what that looked like in your mind, but that's pretty wonderful. I'm glad she told you that you had to go this way.
Yeah, I don't know what would have happened if she had never showed up. Would I still be a musician? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. She was definitely the start of everything, and I will be forever grateful to her for that. Yes. Yeah, she started it all, which she's very pleased with herself for that,
She definitely would be. Well, so I remember following you on social media, and I too have struggled with anxiety and depression disorders since I was a teenager. And I remember, you were very outspoken and shared a lot about it on your social media, which I loved. And I think that we need to talk more about it, because I think a lot of people struggle with it and way more than we think, right? So I'd love to know if you have any words of wisdom or advice for authors who are struggling to maybe manage their mental health and write, because that can be really hard. Like, I've always kind of leaned to writing as a therapeutic process, right? But it can also be really hard to write when I'm feeling really bogged down by anxiety and depression. It can be a hard thing to manage. So any words of wisdom or experience you've had kind of trying to manage those two things?
I don't really have any words of wisdom because I really struggle with this.
Yeah.
And, I'm glad that people talk about this more than they did when I was younger. I had my first panic attack that I can remember when I was in 5th grade. Wow. And I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
And my parents never talked to me about it, and I never talked about it because I had never heard of this before. I thought something was wrong with me. And it wasn't my parents' fault. Like, it just wasn't something that people talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been, I feel like, since that moment, my disorders have been a constant companion, for better or for worse. I feel, it's mental health management, I feel like, is, again, kind of like writing, in the sense that it's very messy and it's a lifelong process.
Yeah. And
you think you have it figured out, and then something happens and you have to go back to square one and figure it out again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's essential to have something that's helped me is having people around me who understand what I'm going through.
Yeah.
In the more challenging times, which the past 2 years have been one of the more challenging periods in my life. And having people around me who either A, understand because they go through it themselves, or B, they don't understand, but they're very empathetic and want to help however they can. That has been a lifesaver for me. And also, storytelling, again, those magical connections we talked about. And not always books. Sometimes it's movies or TV shows, finding stories that comfort me, that bring me joy, that inspire me. That has been huge as well. It's been a huge source of comfort. I'm still working out with my doctors, my health team, what the best what's the word I'm looking for? The best regimen is for me, the best treatment plan. And it's something that I'm still struggling to accept, really. Even as long as I've been living with this, I'm still struggling to accept that, okay, this is part of me.
Right.
It's not going away.
Yeah.
So let's figure out how to manage it and how to accept it. And as far as how that interacts with my art, it's really tough. And I think it's important to talk about how tough it is so that people know they're not alone in it being tough.
Yes.
Because I feel like, I'm so glad that the internet wasn't really a thing when I was super young and dealing with all of this for the first time, because I feel like with the internet, social media and just the news and everything, there are certain perceptions that you start to think are accurate representations of what people are actually like.
Yes.
You think, oh, everybody can handle this so much better than I can.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's so much happier, so much more normal, whatever that means,
Yeah.
than I am. And you start to really get down on yourself because you feel like, at least for me, I should be able to handle this better.
Right.
Other people can handle it. Why can't I handle it?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I manage my work and my mental health and my personal life and all of that as effortlessly as everyone else does?
Yeah.
Which is not true. And I know that rationally.
Yeah.
But it's still a really hard thing to grapple with. I've had to sort of accept the fact that I'm not going to be able to create as quickly as I would like. I'm not going to be able to come out with multiple books a year all the time, which is what I would like to do.
Right.
But, that's something I'm having to accept, is that I have to slow down my pace a little bit. The focus of my life can't necessarily be my work. The focus of my life has to be making sure that I'm healthy, because if I'm not healthy, then nothing else is going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's probably, I hope that's not too much of a downer of an
No.
answer, but I just, I don't really know I don't really have words of wisdom. It's all about, I think, just trying to communicate with the people around you as honestly and as sensitively as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to your gut when it tells you that something is wrong, and not just trying to gloss over that and be like, oh, it's fine, I can handle that. And when you do work, because when you live with mental health disorders, it can sometimes be very challenging to work. When you do work, even more so than with other neurotypical people, I feel like, make sure you love it, and make sure it's something that's not going to take away from you, but it's going to give to you.
Yeah.
It's going to be something that invigorates you and makes you happy to be here, makes you glad to have the work, Yeah. I don't know. I keep telling myself the phrase, it's okay to not be okay.
Mm-hmm.
I keep saying that a lot to myself and to my friends. I say it to my friends and I mean it just so genuinely. And then if somebody says it to me, I'm like, oh, no, that doesn't apply to me. I need to figure it out. I should be able to handle it better. It's not okay to not be okay. I've got to be okay all the time, which is just not true.
Yeah.
It's so much harder to be kinder to ourselves than it is to others. At least for me it is. And so that's something, one day at a time. Some days it's just about one day at a time and getting through the day. Yeah. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And if you are a creator and you feel like everyone's writing faster than me, everyone's publishing more books than me, I know you've heard this before, but I'm going to say it again. It's not about them. It's about you, and it's about your voice and your stories. Doesn't matter what pace they're created at. It doesn't matter if you can only write 200 words a day when other people turn out thousands of words a day.
Right.
Doesn't matter. Keep your eyes on your own paper, and 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 keep your eyes on your own joy, to
Yeah.
protect your joy fiercely, and let your work be a source of rejuvenation for you, and not something that makes you feel worse about yourself.
Yeah.
If your work is constantly making you feel worse about yourself, something's wrong,
Yeah.
and it's time to reassess.
Definitely.
Wow, I could talk about this for hours, but I will wrap it up there. And say again, it's okay to not be okay, and you can create books and create art and create stories, even if you, even if you're trying to manage mental health disorders, even if it's really tough. It may just look different than how other people create, and that's okay.
Definitely okay. And I think those were words of wisdom in my eyes. I think.
Well, thank you.
Yes. I mean, I think just having, open conversations about it can be helpful for anybody who might, feel alone with it. So thank you for sharing all that.
Well, thank you for asking me and for providing a safe space to talk about it. I really do think it's important to talk about this kind of stuff.
Me too.
As much as we can. So again, it's like that, what I was saying with writing. If those words of wisdom that I just shared, which thank you for that, because I never feel wise, but if those words of wisdom touched even one of your listeners and helped them get through the day, like I'm happy about that.
Yes, me too. Awesome. Well, Claire, I just have one final question for you. I have been told by every single person I've interviewed on this podcast that it's the hardest question. I'd love to know what your favorite book is right now. Not your favorite book of all time, but just a book you've read recently that you really loved.
Well, I have right here next to me one of my recent favorite books, which is, can you see it? I think.
Oh, yes.
Star Daughter by Shweta Thakrar. So full disclosure, she's a friend, but I love her book. I have been familiar with this book for years because I read it when it was in early manuscript form, and it's a beautiful book. It's about a girl who is, as I think many of us can relate to, searching for a place to belong and searching for her identity and her sense of self, and she's falling in love and for the first time, and she has wonderful friends and she has a great family, but she is part human and part star, so she is torn between two different realms, and she is trying to navigate kind of muddy familial waters while she's also searching for herself and to figure out who she is. Her voice is so authentic, like, okay, I haven't been a teen for a while, but I've, as a librarian and as an author, I've been around a lot of teens, and this voice feels so authentically teenager to me.
Yeah.
She felt like an actual vulnerable, messy teenager, and I just love the main character. Her name is Sheetal, and she is just so wonderful. It's a book that feels very warm and cozy when you read it because there's so much love in it and so much hope and so much compassion for people, even when they mess up. And wow, in families, everybody messes up all the time, right? Families are very messy, and I love the sense of hope and love in that book. And it's beautifully written. If you like Laini Taylor, her beautiful prose, if you love Neil Gaiman with his just wild imagination and his beautiful imagery, you will love Star Daughter.
Awesome.
So that is something that, yes, I mean, to be fair, I read it originally years ago, but I read the finished version much more recently, and it's a new addition to my shelf, and I love it so much, so I wanted to talk about that for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I love asking that question, even though it can be hard sometimes, because there's so many books out there that we inevitably miss some of them that come out, right? Yes. So it's always good to share ones.
Yeah, I love that question. I'm always happy to talk books, as I'm sure you are as well. So
yes indeed. Claire, thank you so much for chatting with me today, letting us get to know you and hear all about the finale to the Imperium Trilogy.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a delight, and I really enjoyed myself. So thank you again, and everyone, hope you enjoy Lightbringer.
I want to thank you guys so much for listening. Please make sure to rate and review wherever you found this podcast, and let me know what you think about it. If you can't rate and review, please share it. Let's let's chat. Let's connect on Instagram and Twitter at Rose Quinney, QUINNY. And as always, there will be another episode next week. Thanks again, guys.